It started with something as simple as a compliment. Not the over-the-top kind that makes you immediately suspicious or wary, but one of those casual, offhand remarks that slip into your day and linger. He had noticed something about my work, a project I had stayed late for, one of those nights when the office was nearly empty and the fluorescent lights buzzed like a quiet hum of insomnia. He walked past my desk, paused, leaned slightly over the edge of my cubicle and said, "You really saved that campaign. You've got great instincts." I smiled politely, as one does, thanked him and turned back to my screen, but his voice stayed in my head longer than it should have. Not just what he said, but how he said it, like it mattered, like I mattered. At first, I told myself it was nothing. He was kind to everyone, always professional, and I admired that. It wasn't often you came across a manager who actually made the people beneath him feel seen. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He remembered your dog had surgery last weekend, or that you had a dentist appointment. That kind of attention, that presence, it's rare in a corporate world full of circle-back emails and forced small talk in break rooms. Maybe it was just respect I was feeling. Maybe admiration. That's what I told myself, even when I found myself lingering in hallways I knew he'd pass through, or volunteering for tasks I knew would bring me into his orbit. It's a strange thing, having a crush on someone you're not supposed to have feelings for. There's guilt from the very beginning, even before anything happens, even before a single word crosses a line. Because you know they're taken. You know they have a life, in his case, a wife he clearly loves, a family he occasionally mentions in meetings with fondness in his voice. You hear about the way he makes breakfast on weekends or how they renovated their kitchen last spring, and you smile, nod, maybe even joke along. But your stomach tightens because you know you are holding a secret in the middle of your chest that feels a little heavier every time he laughs at your jokes or compliments your ideas. It's not like I ever planned to fall for him. Nobody chooses to be attracted to someone unavailable. It's the opposite of convenient. And yet, emotions have a way of forming in the most inconvenient cracks. It's like water seeping into tiny fractures in concrete, slow, persistent, invisible until one day the damage is undeniable. That's how it happened for me. I started to notice everything about him, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking, the way he leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers behind his head when something amused him. The softness in his voice when he talked about his son's school play or his wife's favorite recipe. It wasn't lust, not really. It was this overwhelming ache, a quiet yearning for closeness, for attention, for warmth that I convinced myself could be platonic if I tried hard enough. I began dressing differently. Not drastically, I didn't want to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. A little more effort, a little more color, heels on days I'd usually wear flats. I told myself it was just about confidence, and maybe it was, but I watched for his reaction. I paid attention to his eyes, and when they lingered even a second longer than necessary, a small part of me lit up. It wasn't right, I knew, but it was real. And when you feel invisible most of your life, when you've sat at the edge of every social circle, when you've been overlooked for promotions, for dates, for attention, that kind of visibility feels intoxicating. The hardest part wasn't pretending not to feel anything. It was pretending that I didn't want anything, that I wasn't fantasizing about conversations that would never happen, about accidental touches that meant more than they should, about what it would be like to be someone he chose not just professionally, but personally. I hated myself for it sometimes. There were moments I'd be typing an email and realize I had replayed our last conversation in my head 5 times already. Moments when I saw a photo of him and his wife on a company slideshow and felt this unbearable twinge of jealousy I had no right to feel. She looked happy, so did he, and I felt like an intruder, an emotional trespasser on sacred ground. But still, the feelings didn't go away. If anything, they deepened. Because it wasn't just attraction anymore. I started to respect him, not just as a boss, but as a person. He handled stress with grace. He defended our team when upper management got aggressive. He checked in when I looked tired or withdrawn. He noticed things. He saw me not in the way I wanted, perhaps, but enough to make my heart ache, and I hated that about myself. That I could care so deeply about someone who could never be mine, that I could crave crumbs of attention like they were sustenance. I began writing about it in a journal, late at night, under the covers, like a teenager with a forbidden secret. Pages filled with confessions I could never speak aloud. I tried everything to stop it. I dated. I went out. I told friends I was too busy to talk about love, but nobody felt like him. Nobody had that quiet steadiness, that intelligence, that spark that made me feel alive just by being near him. I wasn't even sure what I wanted from it. I didn't want to destroy his marriage. I didn't want to be a home wrecker. I just wanted to matter to him more than just another employee, more than just a name on a report. There were moments, tiny, fleeting ones, when I wondered if he felt it too. A hesitation in his voice, a glance that lingered a second too long, a compliment that felt a bit too personal. But maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was projecting. That's the danger of feelings that go unspoken. They mutate into fantasies, and fantasies blur the line between real and imagined. I started overanalyzing everything. Every smile, every pause, every "how are you" felt loaded. And I couldn't tell if it was my own hope twisting reality or if there really was something there, unacknowledged, simmering just beneath the surface. Eventually, I knew I had to do something. Not with him, not directly. I would never cross that line, no matter how badly I wanted to, but with myself. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, this half-life where I was emotionally tied to someone who could never fully be part of mine. So I requested a transfer. Said I wanted to explore other opportunities within the company, broaden my experience. He was supportive as always, said he'd hate to lose me but understood my ambition. He shook my hand the day I left, looked me in the eyes and said, "They're lucky to have you." I nodded, smiled, walked away and cried in the elevator. Distance helped. Not right away, but gradually. Without the daily contact, the feelings began to fade. Not disappear exactly, they still visit sometimes, like a melody that suddenly plays in the background of a quiet moment, but they became quieter, easier to manage. I stopped checking his LinkedIn. I stopped finding excuses to email. I stopped waiting for something that was never meant to happen. Sometimes I still think about him. Not with longing, but with a kind of gentle sadness. He was never mine, but he mattered. Not because of what could have been, but because of what he made me feel alive, worthy, seen, and maybe that's what crushes are sometimes meant to do. Not to lead to something real, but to remind us that we're capable of deep, surprising emotions. That our hearts still beat, even in places they shouldn't. And that, in a world full of quiet, gray monotony, one person's voice can still bring color to your day. I've learned to carry it not as a shameful secret, but as part of my story. An inconvenient truth wrapped in layers of vulnerability and hope. I never told him, I never will, but a part of me will always remember the way he said my name like it mattered. And that, for a while, was enough. Time passed, quietly, unceremoniously. It didn't come with the relief I had hoped for, at least not immediately. I had imagined that walking away, changing departments, schedules, and scenery would dissolve the ache, but I underestimated the persistence of memory. The heart is a slow learner. It clings, even when logic screams at it to let go. I threw myself into work. Piled my desk with reports, stayed late without needing to, volunteered for weekend tasks no one wanted. I wasn't avoiding him anymore, that part was done. I was avoiding the absence of him. There's a difference. Avoidance isn't always about escape. Sometimes it's a ritual of distraction, a way of building noise around a silence that's grown too loud. But even with the distance, he visited me in fragments. Not physically, just in the subtle echoes. A phrase he used in meetings that I caught myself repeating. A cologne someone else wore that stopped me mid-step. A certain shade of blue on someone's tie that twisted something small and sharp inside my chest. I hated that my brain still remembered such irrelevant details, the way his brow furrowed when reading contracts, the rhythm of his footsteps when walking toward the break room. Why do we memorize people we can't have? Why do we hoard these intimate footnotes of someone else's life like they're treasures? Professionally, I was doing better than ever. Promotions came, performance reviews glowed, clients praised. Ironically, the very same man I had walked away from had once said, "You lead like you've already seen the fire and survived it." If only he knew, he was the fire, and surviving him didn't look like strength. It looked like waking up every morning with a dull ache in my chest and putting on lipstick anyway. It looked like smiling in Zoom meetings while my heart sat in my stomach. Confession, I sometimes wrote unsent emails to him. Late at night, when exhaustion blurred the boundaries between sense and sentiment, I'd draft messages I knew would never leave my outbox. Polite but intimate. Formal with a hidden undercurrent. "Hope you're well. Thought of you during this project. You'd have loved how our team handled that pitch." I deleted them the next morning, of course, but in those twilight hours, typing his name felt like touching the hem of a ghost. There was a moment months later when we crossed paths unexpectedly, a leadership summit. Of course, these things are inevitable, a crowded room, name badges, polite handshakes. When I saw him, my pulse betrayed me. It was both everything and nothing. We exchanged pleasantries. He complimented a recent campaign I'd led. I smiled, professional and poised, thanked him with a nod. My voice didn't shake. My hands stayed steady. But inside, I felt like the version of me that used to orbit around him back when everything was still unsaid. He looked good. Still wore that quiet confidence like it was tailored. Still had that way of looking at people that made them feel important. But there was something else, a softness in his eyes, maybe even a curiosity. I wondered if he noticed the change in me, the way I stood taller now, the way I didn't linger in conversation. Maybe he sensed it, the unspoken chapter that we had both left open-ended. Here's the poetic tragedy of it all. We never did anything wrong. No rules were broken, no vows betrayed. And yet, it felt like infidelity of the heart. I hadn't touched him, but I had imagined doing so. I hadn't confessed my feelings, but I had sent them out into the universe like smoke signals, hoping something would come back. There was no affair. Just a slow-burning devotion carried quietly through shared glances and stolen moments of attention. An entire world built between two people in silence. The older I get, the more I understand the weight of emotional boundaries. Physical lines are easier to draw. It's the invisible ones that are hardest to keep. The ones between admiration and longing, between professionalism and emotional intimacy. I was good at my job, I still am, but I had been unprofessional in one very private way. I let myself fall, not publicly, not in a way that compromised him. But in the secret corners of my mind, where no HR policy could reach, and now I carry it not with shame, but with caution. I have learned the difference between fantasy and reality, between being seen and being chosen. Between being captivated by someone's light and mistaking it for a fire you're meant to touch. I have loved, truly loved since him, not in spite of what I felt, but because of it. Loving someone from afar teaches you tenderness. It teaches restraint, patience, the sacredness of boundaries. It teaches you that some stories are meant to be quiet, beautiful, and unfinished, that some people come into your life not to stay, but to awaken a part of you that had long been dormant. He did that for me. He made me feel seen at a time when I felt invisible. And while he was never mine, the version of myself I became in his presence, that sharp, driven, quietly brave woman she still is. People say time heals all wounds. I don't know if that's true. Some feelings don't fade, they just become softer, more manageable. Like background music, always playing, but no longer the soundtrack. Now when I think of him, I don't ache. I don't burn, I simply remember. A man who once looked at me like I mattered, and a woman who once mistook that gaze for something more. We live in a world obsessed with resolution, with neat endings and full circle moments. But some of the most profound stories are the ones that never reach a climax. The ones that live in the in-between, the almost, the could-haves, the beautifully restrained might-have-beens. And in that space, poetic, confessional, dramatic, and professional, I found closure not through a final word, but through quiet acceptance. I noticed her before I realized I noticed her. That's how these things begin, not with a lightning strike, but with a flicker. A shift in awareness. A certain energy in the air that bends your attention in a direction you didn't intend to look. She had that rare kind of presence, not loud, not needy, but there. Quietly magnetic. The kind of presence that doesn't walk into a room demanding attention, but somehow ends up holding yours anyway. At first, it was purely professional. She was sharp, frighteningly so. The kind of person who read between the lines, not just in documents, but in people. She anticipated what clients needed before they could articulate it. She listened with her whole body. She had that lean-in kind of focus that made people feel important. I admired that. I admired her. And maybe that's where the line began to blur, not in anything either of us said or did, but in the feeling that settled somewhere between respect and curiosity. I've been married for 12 years. I love my wife, truly. Our relationship has been built on honesty, weathered storms, shared laughter, and the quiet routines that make up real life. Ours is not a cinematic love, but it is a steady one, the kind of love that takes effort, sacrifice, forgiveness. But even a steady love can't shield you from the complexity of the human heart. You can be full and still long for something different. Not better, just different. Something that speaks to a part of you that hasn't been spoken to in a long time. That's what she did. She reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't touched in years, younger, more alive, more curious. She challenged me. She made me laugh in a way that was too easy, too natural. She understood nuance. She wasn't just good at her job, she felt things. She brought depth into every room she entered. I found myself drawn to that without realizing how deep the pull had become. There was nothing improper. No texts beyond work hours, no suggestive comments, no violations of policy or decency, and yet I felt compromised, not in action but in thought. In the way I anticipated her smile when I passed her desk, in the way her voice made me pause longer than it should, in the strange comfort of knowing she noticed me in the way others hadn't in years. My wife sees me, but this woman saw something else, something I had forgotten about myself. And that was dangerous. The worst part was that I think she knew. She never said anything. But she felt it too, didn't she? That shared silence that sometimes filled the air between us like a low hum. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where our eyes held a little too long. Where her laughter softened into something warmer. Where I wanted to say more but chose not to. And I don't know if I regret the restraint or applaud it. When she requested a transfer, something in me dropped. I smiled when she told me, encouraged her ambition, congratulated her with the grace expected of a leader. But inside, I felt the ground shift. She was leaving, and she would never know what she had meant to me, how close I had come on more than one occasion to crossing an invisible line. Not with touch, not with words, but with intention. And that perhaps would have been worse. The day she left, I watched her walk out of the office for the last time. She didn't look back. I think I loved her a little more for that, for not needing to make it dramatic. For not asking me to feel what she already knew I felt. She left with dignity, and in that she taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. Time passed. The world didn't end. My marriage remained intact, stronger, even in ways I hadn't expected. Because after she left, I confronted myself, not her, me. I looked in the mirror and asked the questions I had been avoiding. Was I unhappy? Was I seeking something my wife couldn't give? Or was I simply lonely in a way I didn't want to admit? The answers weren't easy, but they were necessary. Loving someone you cannot have, especially when you already have someone who loves you, is not just emotionally complicated, it's ethically excruciating. Because every day you choose not to act is a victory, and yet every day you want to act is a quiet betrayal. I lived in that tension for longer than I'm proud of, and I still live with the memory of it. I think of her sometimes. Not with longing, but with a strange blend of gratitude and ache. She reminded me I was still capable of feeling something deep, unexpected, electric. She reminded me that temptation doesn't always come dressed in drama. Sometimes it comes gently, like a kindness you didn't know you were starving for, but I didn't touch it. I didn't take what wasn't mine. And maybe that's the real story here, not the love that could have happened, but the choice not to let it. In another life, maybe I would have met her first. In another version of my story, maybe she would be the one I made pancakes for on Sundays. But in this life, she was a mirror. A moment, a beautiful almost, we all have them. People who pass through our lives and awaken something we didn't know was sleeping. We don't always get to keep them, but we carry them, quietly, carefully. Forever, and in the privacy of my mind, I send her well wishes. I hope she found someone who sees her not just for what she brings to a boardroom, but for what she carries in her heart. I hope she's laughing often. I hope someone holds her gaze like I once did, and this time doesn't look away. Because if there's one thing I know now, it's this. Not every love story is meant to be lived out loud. Some are meant to be felt, cherished, and then respectfully let go. She was mine only in silence. And that silence, though heavy, was sacred. Years had passed. The seasons had turned over themselves again and again, like worn pages in a book reread too often. Life had filled in the empty spaces between what was and what might have been. I no longer replayed the memory of him daily. The ache had softened into something more abstract, like a song I used to love but hadn't heard in years, familiar but no longer raw. He had become part of my history, not my present, not my future. I had built a life, a real one, not perfect but mine. A partner who loved me not in quiet glances or unsaid words, but with presence, with hands that held, with truths that were spoken plainly. I had grown into a woman who no longer chased the thrill of the unattainable, but found peace in what was real, what stayed, what came home at night. I had almost forgotten the way he used to look at me, not because it didn't matter, but because I had made space for things that mattered more. But fate has its own peculiar sense of timing. It was a conference, one of those industry gatherings full of polite nods, recycled buzzwords, and overpriced coffee. I had been invited to speak. Apparently, my name meant something now. I wore my confidence like a second skin, crisp blazer, poised smile, notes folded neatly in my bag but barely needed. I was not the same woman who had once lingered outside his office just for a passing glance. That version of me existed in another lifetime. She had loved deeply, quietly. And she had survived it. I saw him during the luncheon. The room was loud with conversation, the kind of orchestrated networking that never quite feels natural. I turned, and there he was, older, yes, a little more gray at the temples, but still him. That same thoughtful expression, the one that looked like he was always listening even when he wasn't speaking. For a moment, time curled around us like a breath held too long. Our eyes met. And just like that, we were both back there, not in space, but in memory. He crossed the room with the quiet ease I remembered. We exchanged the kind of smile only two people who share an unwritten story can. Not regret, not longing, just recognition. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, voice a little rougher with time but still familiar. I could say the same. I replied, steady. We made small talk, careers, cities, family. I learned he had changed roles, moved to a new branch. His wife still painted. His son was in college now. I told him about my latest project, my partner, how we had adopted a rescue dog who had taken over the house. We laughed, genuinely, and beneath that laughter was something fragile and warm, closure, that elusive thing we had never quite found the words for. There was a pause, not awkward but full. "I'm glad to see you happy," he said, eyes softer than I remembered. "I am," I said. "And I hope you are too," he nodded slowly. "I am. We've both come a long way." And it was true. The years had carved out the ache, leaving only understanding in its place. We had both chosen the harder path, the one that meant walking away from something that shimmered but couldn't stay. And now, standing there in that crowded conference hall, I realized something I never could back then. We had never needed to be together for the connection to matter. What we shared, that silent, aching almost, wasn't a mistake. It was a chapter. Brief, unconsummated, but real. It had shaped us and then released us. That's the thing about certain people, they're not meant to stay, but to show you something. A mirror, a lesson, a spark that reminds you you're alive. I didn't say goodbye, not formally. There was no need. We parted like two people who had finally put a story down and closed the cover gently, reverently. I walked away, not with a heavy heart, but with a light one. Not with longing, but with peace. That was the last time I saw him, and I don't wonder what could have been any more. I know now, what could have been would have cost too much. And what was, in all its restraint and poetry and tension, was enough. More than enough. We were a moment. A beautiful, impossible, necessary moment, and now we are simply a memory. But what a memory it was.